A coastline should not move when no one is watching. Elendil, a young cartographer from the island kingdom of Numenor, knew this with a chilling certainty as his pen traced the newly jagged edges of Middle-earth. His work was far more than lines on parchment. It was a quiet act of rebellion, a desperate attempt to unite the free peoples against a rising shadow in the east. With every dangerous expedition, he risked his reputation and his life, uncovering a terrifying pattern. The Dark Lord Sauron was not just raising armies, he was warping the very geography of the world, twisting rivers and raising mountains to suit his terrible designs. This set the stage for a conflict where the most powerful weapon was not a sword, but a map. By the end of this story, you will understand how the drawn line of a cartographer can change the fate of continents and decide the outcome of a war. We will see how entire kingdoms were built on the foundation of a single chart, and how a hidden betrayal nearly unraveled it all. I am curious, where are you listening from right now, and what is the local time where you are? What do you think is the true cost of preserving knowledge when shadows gather? The ink on Elendil's first map was barely dry when he led his small team ashore in Eriador. Their mission was simple and perilous: to verify the shape of the world before Sauron could redraw it entirely. They moved through a landscape of silent, ancient forests and jagged hills, a place where every shadow seemed to hold its breath. Trusting no one, they relied on the stars and their own instincts, knowing that a single misplaced footstep could lead them into a chasm or an ambush. It was during one of these tense, sun-dappled treks that the lead scout, a man named Elendil, froze. He pointed to a pattern in the moss covering the forest floor, a subtle, winding ribbon of a different green. It was a path, but one made with such subtle artistry that it was invisible to any but the most trained eye. This was no dwarven road or man-made trail. It was an elven path, a secret route used by the Firstborn, and it was not on any map in Numenor. The discovery was a triumph, a validation of their entire purpose. Here was proof that their world held secrets even the Dark Lord might not know, and that their careful, observant methods could uncover them. Elendil felt a surge of hope as he carefully charted the path's gentle curve between the great trees. But that hope was swiftly cut with ice. The very next day, Elendil returned from a scouting run with a grim report. He had seen figures moving through the trees at a distance, not elves or rangers, but men clad in rough, dark garb. They moved with a purpose that was not exploration, but pursuit. They were being hunted. Elendil gathered his team in a sheltered hollow, the precious new map spread between them. The choice before them was stark. They could press on, following the elven path deeper into the unknown, hoping it led to a safe haven or another discovery worth the immense risk. Or they could turn back now, racing for the coast with their vital intelligence. A single parchment that proved the land itself could be an ally. To go forward was to gamble all their lives on an unseen road. To turn back was to save their knowledge, but perhaps abandon a greater truth. The weight of the decision settled on Elendil, heavier than any pack. They were no longer just cartographers. They were carriers of a secret, and that made them the most valuable prey in the wilderness. The elven path did not lead to a hidden city, but to a secret purpose. Elendil and his team harried but alive, finally reached the coast and sailed for home. He carried more than a map. He carried a conviction. That conviction led him to a hidden chamber, deep within the foothills of the Blue Mountains. A place where stone met root and ancient power hummed in the air. Here, in a vaulted hall lit by soft, glowing crystals, Elendil unrolled his parchments before the most powerful figures in the West. An elven lord with eyes like starlight sat beside a dwarven king whose beard was braided with gems, their respective retinues standing stiffly apart. The air was thick with a silence older than the mountains themselves, a legacy of ancient grievances and a deep, mutual distrust. Elendil's voice was calm but firm as he pointed to the newly drawn elven paths and the shifted river courses his team had documented. He spoke not of conquest, but of connection, not of borders, but of bottlenecks. He showed them how Sauron's manipulations were not random acts of malice, but a calculated strategy. The Dark Lord was choking the old trade routes, isolating their strongholds, and forcing their people into pockets where they could be picked off one by one. He argued that their strength lay not in their separate armies, but in their shared knowledge of the land. A dwarven lord, his voice a low rumble, scoffed. He declared that no map could protect his mountain halls, that stone and steel were the only defenses that mattered. An elven diplomat coolly questioned the accuracy of the charts, suggesting that the short lives of men made their observations fleeting and unreliable. The alliance, so desperately needed, was crumbling before it was even born. Elendil did not raise his voice. Instead, he placed a single finger on the map, on a narrow pass high in the misty mountains. He turned to the dwarf. "Your eastern gates," he said, "are fed by a spring that emerges here." "Yes," the dwarf nodded, his eyes narrowing. Elendil then turned to the elf. "And your people, my lord, travel the high winds above this very pass to reach the ancient groves to the south. If Sauron's forces were to collapse the northern face of this peak, as my scouts report he is attempting, he would not conquer either of you. He would simply sever the artery that connects you. He would starve one kingdom of its water and the other of its fastest route to its allies. You would be alone." A heavy silence fell. The shared geographical reality, laid bare by a simple line on parchment, was more compelling than any plea for friendship. It was a cold, hard calculation of survival. The dwarven king grunted, a sound of grudging acceptance. The elven lord's stern expression softened into one of grim understanding. That day, a fragile pact was forged, not on a foundation of trust, but on the undeniable logic of the map. As the council disbanded, Elendil felt a profound unease. He had won the argument, but in doing so, he had placed himself at the very center of a web of powers, far greater than his own. He had given the free peoples a weapon, and in return, he had made himself the most dangerous man in Middle-earth to the Dark Lord in the east. The alliance forged in the mountain hall was a thing of parchment and cold logic, but it required a living, breathing intelligence to give it power. That need drew Elendil deeper into the world of the elves, to a workshop hidden within a grove of silver-barked trees. Here, the air itself seemed to shimmer with a subtle music, and the elven smiths worked not with roaring forges, but with starlight and song. They were creating the Palantiri, a set of 7 perfect crystal spheres. These were not mere jewels. They were seeing stones, devices that could pierce the veil of distance, allowing a skilled user to gaze across hundreds of miles as if looking through a clear window. The potential was staggering, a way to watch Sauron's troop movements in real time, to coordinate the far-flung armies of the Alliance without a single rider risking the dangerous roads. Yet the stones had a profound limitation. Their vision was vast, but it was also formless, like staring into a featureless sea. To see a specific place, a single fortress or a mountain pass, the user needed to hold a perfect mental image of that location. A single flaw in that mental map, a misplaced ridge or a forgotten river bend, and the stone's gaze would slide right over the intended target, lost in the blur of the world. Elendil's maps were the key. He spent months with the Elven masters, his precise charts spread beside the glowing orbs. He would point to a contour line on the parchment, describing the exact angle of a cliff face, or the particular way a river forked around a stand of ancient oaks. An elf would then place their hands upon a Palantiri, their mind focused, and the stone's vision would snap into sharp, breathtaking clarity, revealing the very scene Elendil had documented. It was a profound partnership, a merging of elven craft with Númenórean diligence, and it built a bond of deep respect between them. This trust, however, became the project's greatest vulnerability. Among the Númenórean assistants was a cartographer named Kemen, a man Elendil had known for years. He was talented and eager, and in the spirit of the new alliance, Elendil granted him access to the most sensitive calibration charts, the master documents that linked the Palantiri to the strategic heartlands of their enemies. He did not see the quiet resentment festering in Kemen's heart, a jealousy fueled by the favor shown to Elendil, and a growing fear of the elves' perceived dominance. One evening, an elven sentinel noticed Kemen attempting to slip away from the grove, a tightly rolled scroll case hidden beneath his cloak. He was not heading for the Númenórean quarters, but toward the eastern woods, a known route for smugglers and spies. Intercepted and brought before Elendil, Kemen broke down. He confessed that an agent of a petty lord, aligned with Sauron, had promised him wealth and a position of power in the New Order, in exchange for the calibration keys. With those documents, the enemy could have not only seen the Alliance's strongholds, but worse, they could have fed false images back through the stones, creating phantom armies and fake disasters to sow chaos and discord. The betrayal was a chilling lesson. The very tools they had built for unity were also powerful instruments of deception. The maps that could connect them could also, in the wrong hands, guide the enemy directly to their door. From that day forward, the security around the Palantiri became as vital as the stones themselves, and the weight of every line Elendil drew felt heavier, knowing that a single trusted hand could turn his life's work into a weapon against everything he held dear. The river crossing at Tharbad was the fragile alliance's most vital artery. Every shipment of dwarven steel and every company of elven archers bound for the front lines had to pass through this ancient, fortified town. Its security was paramount, and its defense was planned around the meticulous charts drawn by Elendil's own hand. So when supply convoys began to vanish, not to orc raids, but to simple, inexplicable misfortunes like collapsed bridges and suddenly unnavigable channels, a cold suspicion settled in Elendil's heart. The problem was not the land, but the maps that were supposed to master it. The errors were subtle: a shallow ford marked as deep, a stable riverbank charted as gravel when it was actually soft, shifting silt. They were mistakes only a fellow cartographer would make, and only one with access to the master copies could introduce. The traitor was not a soldier or a smuggler, but one of his own. His name was Baron, a man who had shared Elendil's fire on a dozen cold nights in the wild, a man who had helped him trace the very elven paths that first gave them hope. The betrayal was a poison in the well of their fellowship. Elendil devised a test. He created 3 slightly different versions of a critical map, detailing new patrol routes around Tharbad. He gave one to each of his 3 most trusted lieutenants, including Baron, when a Sauron-aligned raiding party ambushed a patrol using the exact false routes from Baron's copy. The proof was as stark as a bloodstain on parchment. Elendil did not send guards. He went himself, confronting Baron on the stone arches of the Great Bridge, the churning waters of the Guatbo River below them. Baron did not deny it. He spoke of fear, of seeing the shadow in the east as an unstoppable tide. He argued that by feeding Sauron minor victories, he was buying a chance for their people to survive, to be spared when the final conquest came. He pleaded that his was not malice, but a terrible, pragmatic mercy. The Dwarven and Elven commanders demanded his head, a swift and public execution to serve as a warning. But standing there, looking at the man he had called a friend, Elendil saw the true cost of the war they were fighting. It was not just fought with swords and strategy, but with the corruption of trust itself. To kill Baron was to admit that the shadow could break any bond. Instead, Elendil stripped him of his rank and his tools, and had him imprisoned in a remote, high valley with the elves, a gilded cage where he could cause no more harm, but would also not become a martyr. It was an act of mercy that angered his allies, who saw it as a dangerous weakness. Yet as the corrected maps restored the flow of supplies and secured Tharbad, Elendil was left with a more insidious enemy than any spy. It was the lingering doubt that now colored every shared glance, every piece of advice, every rolled parchment handed to him by another. He had secured their operations, but he had lost something far more essential, the simple faith that the hand holding the pen was always a friend. The lingering doubt from Baron's betrayal was a luxury Elendil could no longer afford. A new and more immediate threat was emerging, carried on the thin, cold winds from the east. Rumors spoke of Sauron's surveyors, not orcs but skilled dwarven renegades and desperate men, secretly charting the high, forgotten passes of the misty mountains. Their goal was not conquest, but infiltration, to create a hidden highway for his armies to pour into the heartlands of the free peoples undetected. The strategic balance of the entire war now hinged on a race to map the roof of the world. Elendil's expedition was small, fast, and carried the weight of nations on its shoulders. They left in the dead of night, their path taking them up into a world of stone and sky, where the air grew thin and every breath was a conscious effort. The mountains were not a passive landscape. They were a hostile, living entity. Sauron's influence here was felt not in armies, but in the very instability of the rock. One morning, the thunderous roar of a distant avalanche echoed across the peaks, a cascade of snow and stone deliberately triggered by enemy sappers to block a known route and cover their own secretive progress. Elendil and his team were forced to climb higher, along treacherous ridges where a single misstep meant a fall into oblivion. Their greatest challenge came deep within a labyrinth of caves, a network they believed was a shortcut through the central massif. Using their climbing ropes and hammers, they ventured into the darkness, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. The enemy had been there before them. They found evidence of recent surveying marks chiseled into the walls, but also subtle traps. Kemen, the cartographer who had replaced Baron, was testing the stability of a limestone pillar when the entire chamber began to groan. The enemy had weakened key supports, hoping a cave-in would bury any pursuers. Rocks crashed down around them, sealing the entrance and filling the air with a choking dust. For a terrifying hour, they were entombed, their fate resting on finding another way out, guided only by Elendil's memory of the mountain's external shape and his intuition for how water might flow through the stone. They eventually found a narrow fissure, a crack that led them back to the starlight, gasping and covered in grime, but alive. Their success was hard-won. They emerged from the peaks with a complete and accurate chart of every viable pass, noting which were stable, which were watched by the enemy, and which were death traps. This intelligence was a masterstroke. It allowed the Elven lords to position their archers on impossible perches, and gave the dwarven armies the knowledge to fortify the true weak points in their mountain defenses. For the first time, the allies could anticipate Sauron's movements instead of merely reacting to them. The tactical edge was undeniable, yet as Elendil looked at the exhausted, frostbitten faces of his team, he knew the cost. They had spent weeks of crucial time and strained their resources to the limit for this single victory. They had won the race for the mountains, but it felt less like a triumph and more like a desperate bid to plug one leak in a dam that was beginning to crack everywhere at once. The true confrontation was not for a pass or a valley, but for the future itself, and that battle was still gathering its strength in the shadowed lands of the east. The desperate race for the mountains was soon overshadowed by the thunder of war. Sauron's true assault began not with hidden passes, but with the brute force of his main host, a tide of iron and fire that swept westward to crush the heart of Elvencraft. The target was a region, a land of gentle hills and silver forges, and its destruction was methodical. The Dark Lord's armies did not just seek to conquer its cities, they aimed to erase its memory, making straight for the great libraries and map rooms where the geographical soul of the western lands was kept. Elendil received the frantic summons and sailed with all the speed he could muster, his small fleet of Númenórean ships landing on a coast already hazy with the smoke of burning groves. What he found was a scene of calculated devastation. The enemy was not merely looting, they were burning knowledge itself, tossing priceless scrolls and star charts onto pyres that lit the night with a terrible orange glow. His mission shifted in an instant from reinforcement to rescue. He had to get the archives out. He gathered a band of volunteers, a mix of his own seasoned cartographers and the few elven warriors who could be spared from the crumbling defensive lines. Their charge was to fight their way to the central scriptorium, a tower that was now an island in a sea of chaos. The battle was a nightmare of close-quarters confusion. They fought in corridors choked with smoke, the air thick with the shouts of men, the screams of the dying, and the crackle of hungry flames. Elendil, who had spent his life wielding a pen, now found a sword in his hand, parrying blows from orc scimitars as his comrades formed a shield wall around the scholars who were frantically stuffing scrolls into leather cases. He saw a young apprentice, a boy who had once helped him mix inks, cut down while trying to shield a tube of ancient vellum. The loss was a physical blow, but it only hardened his will. He roared orders, his voice cutting through the din, directing his dwindling force with a commander's instinct he never knew he possessed. They became a single, desperate organism, fighting for every inch of ground. Their goal not a military victory, but the salvation of a few hundred pounds of parchment. When they finally burst from the scriptorium, the archives secure, they left behind a fortress of fire and the bodies of many friends. The retreat to the ships was a blur of exhaustion and grief. Standing on the deck as a region burned behind them, Elendil was no longer just a map maker. The fire had forged him into a leader, tempered by loss and burdened by the weight of every life spent to save those maps. He carried the knowledge that would guide the final, great alliance, but the cost of that knowledge was etched forever in his memory, a silent debt to the fallen that would shape every decision he made from that day forward. The sea winds carried the taste of ash and salt. Elendil guided the survivors north along the rugged coast, a ragged column of exhausted elves and his own few remaining Númenóreans. Their only hope was to reach the elven haven of Lindon, a sanctuary that now felt a world away. They were not just fleeing an army, they were a library on the move, every salvaged map case, a treasure more vital than gold, and a burden that marked them for death. The enemy knew what they carried. Orc packs, swift and ruthless, began to harry their flanks, their howls echoing through the pine forests that ran down to the shore. Elendil's command was simple. They could not outrun their pursuers on the open road. They had to outthink them. He unrolled his most detailed chart of the region, his eyes tracing lines that were not roads, but memories of the land itself. He led them away from the coast, into a treacherous landscape of fissured limestone and sudden, deep gorges known as the Loon Fens. It was a place most travelers wisely avoided, a maze of unstable ground and deceptive pools of black water. To the orcs, it was an impassable barrier. To Elendil, it was a map of escape. He navigated by the subtle lay of the land, by the types of moss on the rocks, and the specific song of the birds in the stunted trees. He remembered a conversation with an old hunter years before, a story about a hidden causeway of solid rock that wound through the heart of the Fens, a secret path used only by the local folk in times of dire need. He found it, a narrow ribbon of gray stone barely visible above the murky water. For 2 days and 2 nights, they moved in single file, their feet sore and their spirits frayed. The orcs, confused by the broken terrain, fell behind, their frustrated cries growing distant, but the land itself was the final enemy. At one narrow point, a young elf carrying a tube of star charts lost his footing on the slick stone, tumbling into the deep, cold water with a cry. Without a moment's hesitation, Elendil plunged in after him. The current was strong, the water like ice, but he fought his way to the struggling elf, seizing the precious map case first, before dragging the gasping youth back to the causeway. He emerged shivering, his clothes heavy with filth, but the knowledge was safe. That act, more than any command, cemented his authority. He was not just their guide, he was their guardian. When they finally stumbled out of the Fens and saw the green, sheltered hills of Lindon ahead, a profound silence fell over the company. They had arrived not as refugees, but as a united force, bound by a shared ordeal. Elendil's reputation was no longer that of a scholar in a dusty room. but of a man who knew the soul of the land so intimately he could use it as a shield. He had saved the maps, and in doing so, he had forged the survivors into the first true soldiers of the last alliance. The green hills of Lindon were a balm to the weary, but Elendil found no rest. In a high chamber open to the sea wind, he stood beside the High King of the Elves, Gil-galad, whose presence was as calm and deep as the ocean. Between them, the rescued maps were unrolled, their lines now the foundation for the last, best hope of the free peoples. This was no longer about discovery, it was about deployment. Elendil's knowledge of the land met Gil-galad's ancient wisdom of war, and together they began to weave a new kind of strategy. They did not just plot army positions, they orchestrated the landscape itself. A narrow pass was not a point on a map, but a potential kill zone. A dense forest was not an obstacle, but a screen for movement. A high, barren plateau became a perfect place for an ambush, but only if their forces could be told to get there at the exact right moment. This was the great challenge. Their armies were scattered across hundreds of miles, with orc bands and Sauron spies cutting the messenger routes. How could they possibly coordinate such a complex dance? The answer came from the maps themselves. Elendil noticed a pattern of unique, prominent landmarks, visible for miles in the clear air of the north. A single, lightning-blasted oak on a hilltop. A peculiar, twisted peak in the misty mountains. A certain waterfall that caught the morning sun in a specific way. These were not just features, they were signals. He and Gil-galad devised a simple, brilliant system. A carefully controlled fire on the blasted oak's hill might mean a flank was secure. A large, reflective shield, flashing from the twisted peak, could warn of an enemy advance from the east. It was a language of light and geography, a way to send messages across vast distances without a single rider. But this system demanded a profound and unspoken trust. An elven sentinel had to believe the signal flashed from a distant crag by a man he had never met. A Númenórean captain had to commit his entire company based on the flicker of a far-off fire lit by an elf. There was no room for doubt, no space for the old prejudices that had once divided their peoples. In those long days of planning, a silent pact was forged between Elendil and Gil-galad that went beyond kings and cartographers. It was the trust that the land, when rid correctly, did not belong to elf or man, but to the cause of light. This fragile network of signals became the nervous system of their alliance, a web of light waiting to be activated, holding the promise of uniting their strength at the decisive hour. The trust forged in Lindon was soon tested by a betrayal from the sea. Rumors whispered of swift, black-sailed ships striking the vulnerable coastal villages, burning storehouses and kidnapping skilled artisans. These were not orcs, but Númenóreans, men of Elendil's own blood, seduced by Sauron's promises of power and eternal life. They were the Corsairs of Umbar, and they moved with an unnerving precision, striking where defenses were weakest and vanishing back into the sea lanes. The most chilling intelligence reported that their captains navigated using charts, stolen from the royal archives in Númenor itself. The very maps meant to protect the shores were now guiding the knives to its throat. Elendil knew he could not command the entire alliance from a chamber in Lindon, while his homeland's traders ravaged its children. He gathered a small fleet of his most loyal mariners and set sail, not as a king, but as a hunter. The sea was his oldest map, a parchment of shifting currents and hidden dangers. He knew the Corsairs relied on the stolen charts, which showed the main trade routes and deep water harbors. But Elendil possessed a deeper knowledge, the kind passed down from father to son over generations of sailing these coasts. He knew of submerged reefs that lurked just beneath the surface at low tide, invisible to any but the most experienced eye. He knew of treacherous, localized currents that could seize a ship's hull and dash it against the rocks. He knew where the evening fogs gathered thickest, perfect for an ambush. He laid his trap in a narrow channel the Corsairs were using as a shortcut, a place their stolen maps marked as safe passage. He positioned his smaller, more agile ships behind a screen of rocky islets, using the fog as his cloak and the hidden reefs as his frontline soldiers. When the black sails of the Corsair fleet emerged from the mist, arrogance was their downfall. They sailed in a tight, confident formation, trusting the stolen knowledge in their hands. Elendil gave the signal. His ships did not engage them directly. Instead, they used their superior knowledge of the local waters to herd them, feinting attacks and then retreating, luring the larger Corsair vessels toward the jagged teeth of the submerged reef. The lead Corsair ship, a grand vessel with a serpent prow, struck the hidden stone with a sickening crunch of splintering timber. The ship behind it, unable to turn in the narrow, current-swept channel, collided with its flank. In moments, the channel was a chaos of foundering ships and panicked crews. Elendil's fleet then closed in, their arrows finding easy targets in the disorganized mass. The battle was less a fight and more an execution of a perfect plan, a victory won not by superior force, but by superior understanding. The water washed red with the blood of Númenóreans that day, a bitter victory that secured the coastline and proved the value of Elendil's intimate, living cartography. But as his men took prisoners and surveyed the wreckage, they found more than just plunder. Among the captured charts were notes in the margins, written in a familiar hand, detailing recent changes to patrol schedules and the locations of new, secret supply caches. The infiltration was not a simple theft from a dusty archive. It was an ongoing conspiracy, a cancer within the very heart of Númenor. The enemy was not just at the gates. He was in the house, and he had been reading their mail. Elendil stood on the deck of his ship, the taste of salt and victory ash in his mouth, knowing he had won a crucial battle, but the war for the soul of his own people had just begun. The sea victory against the Corsairs left a bitter aftertaste of suspicion, a poison that made every chart in Elendil's possession feel like a potential trap. He needed a foundation of knowledge untainted by Sauron's lies or the betrayals of men. That foundation was rumored to lie in the deepest south, in a place known only through fragmented dwarven sagas, a city so ancient its very name had been lost to time. The lore spoke of the halls of the Stargazers, a civilization from the first age that had charted the heavens and the earth before the shadow fell. Guided by these cryptic verses and a single aging dwarf named Borin, who remembered the old tales, Elendil led a small, hand-picked team into the blistering, red rock canyons. The journey itself was a test of their maps, for the landmarks had shifted over millennia, and the rivers sung of in the sagas were now dry, cracked beds of stone. They finally found it not by sight, but by silence, a hidden valley, sheltered by towering cliffs, where the wind made no sound and the air was unnervingly still. There, Carved into the living rock of the mountain itself were the ruins of a city, its grand arches and plazas empty and perfect, as if its inhabitants had simply vanished between one breath and the next. It was not a ruin of decay, but of preservation, a place frozen outside of time. The entrance to the central library was a gaping maw of darkness, flanked by statues of robed figures holding astrolabes and unrolled stone scrolls. Borin ran a calloused hand over the carvings at the threshold, his voice a low whisper. He warned them that the Stargazers did not guard their secrets with locks, but with the world itself. The first chamber was a labyrinth of shifting floors, where certain stones, when stepped upon, would trigger silent counterweights that caused entire sections of the wall to pivot, sealing corridors and opening new, deadly ones. They had to move with the deliberate slowness of a leaf on water, testing every step, their progress measured in inches per hour. Deeper inside, they found a hall whose ceiling was a perfect, polished obsidian mirror, reflecting the floor below in infinite, dizzying repetition. The path across was a series of isolated pillars, but the reflection made it impossible to tell which pillars were real stone and which were mere illusion. One of Elendil's men, staring too long into the abyss below his feet, lost his balance and would have fallen had Borin not grabbed his cloak. The dwarf closed his eyes, explaining that the only way across was to feel the way, to ignore the treacherous sight, and trust only to the solid touch of the stone under his boots. The final chamber was the heart of the city, a circular library where the walls were covered in maps, carved not on parchment, but on veins of luminous crystal that pulsed with a soft inner light. These were not maps of Middle-earth as they knew it. They showed coastlines that had sunk beneath the sea, mountain ranges that had been ground to dust, and forests that were now barren plains. They were charts of a world from the First Age, a world before Sauron, and they held a terrifying revelation. One vast crystal map depicted a land to the east, and at its center was a fiery mountain, or a Druin, Mount Doom. But on this ancient chart, the mountain was not a place of darkness. It was depicted as a natural, powerful forge, a focal point of the Earth's fire that the Stargazers had once studied. The key was in the delicate, crystalline lines that surrounded it, a web of geological faults and energy flows. Elendil realized with a jolt that Sauron had not created the mountain's power. He had merely hijacked it, plugging his own dark will into a pre-existing natural circuit. His fortress of Barad-dûr was not just a tower, it was a tap, drawing its strength from these ancient flows. To break his power, one would not need to defeat his army, but to sever that connection. As this truth dawned on him, the chamber's magic turned hostile. The pulsing light from the crystals grew erratic, strobing violently, and a high, keening whine filled the air, a sound that seemed to drill directly into the mind. It was a psychic defense, an assault on sanity itself, dredging up personal fears and regrets. Elendil saw visions of burning ships and the faces of men he had condemned to death. Borin roared a dwarven hymn of grounding and stone, fighting back the mental intrusion with sheer, stubborn will. They grabbed what they could, carefully prying a few of the smaller, key crystal maps from the wall, and fled the maddening chamber, stumbling back into the blinding sunlight as changed men. They had paid for their prize with their peace of mind, but they carried a hope that was older than the shadow, a blueprint for its undoing. The crystal maps from the Stargazers did not reveal a path to victory, but a vulnerability in the enemy's very foundation. This knowledge demanded a weapon, one that could strike at the heart of that ancient, corrupted power. The elven smiths of Linden, led by the venerable Celebrimbor, conceived of a blade of unparalleled purity, to be forged from a rare star iron ore, found only in the deepest, most secret veins of the misty mountains. They would call it Anduril, flame of the west, but the smiths could not find the ore alone. Their craft was fire and song, not the silent language of stone. They needed Elendil. His role was to become a geologist of the desperate, translating the mineral whispers of the earth into a guide for the smith's hammers. He pored over his own survey charts and the older, crystalline maps, cross-referencing the types of rock, the flow of underground streams, and the peculiar magnetic anomalies that often signaled rich metallic deposits. He was not just looking for a mountain, he was searching for a single, perfect seam of ore within that mountain, a vein that had slept untouched since the world was young. His charts led them to a place the dwarves called Nulakisden, a long-abandoned mine complex where the air was thin and the silence was absolute. The entrance was a mere crack in the granite, hidden behind a waterfall that froze in the winter, creating a curtain of ice. Inside, Elendil's maps were their only light, his contour lines predicting the treacherous drop-offs and unstable ceilings that threatened to bury them. They found the vein, a ribbon of dark, glittering metal running through the rock like a frozen river of night sky. The work of extraction began, a slow, painstaking process of careful hammer strokes and whispered encouragement. But the shadow had eyes everywhere. On the third night, as the first raw chunks of ore were being prepared for transport, the sentries gave a hushed alarm. A small, specialized team of orc saboteurs, led by a hulking Uruk, had found the entrance. Their goal was not conquest, but collapse, to bring the entire mountainside down upon the precious ore and seal the legend of Anduril before it was ever born. Elendil and his small guard of Númenóreans met them in the narrow tunnel leading to the heart of the mine. The fight was a brutal, close-quarters affair in near-total darkness, lit only by the flickering torchlight that cast monstrous shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Swords rang against crude scimitars, the echoes a deafening cacophony in the confined space. Elendil, standing shoulder to shoulder with his men, realized they could not win a war of attrition in the tunnel. He shouted an order over the din, his voice raw, "Fall back to the ore chamber." He had remembered a detail from his original survey, a notation of a fragile limestone pillar that supported a section of the ceiling in an adjacent, unused gallery. As his men made a fighting retreat, he broke away, moving through a side passage only he knew was there. He reached the pillar, and with a few heavy, calculated blows from a pickaxe, he fractured its base. The ceiling groaned, and a cascade of rock and dust filled the gallery, completely blocking the saboteurs' main route of approach and cutting their force in half. The remaining orcs, confused and leaderless, were quickly dispatched. He had used the mountain's own weakness as a weapon, turning the map's knowledge into a tactical advantage. When the first ingot of purified star iron was finally drawn from the forge in Linden, its cold, silver fire seemed to hold more than just metal. It held the memory of a hidden waterfall, the taste of dust-choked air, and the desperate, calculated risk that had secured its birth. Elendil had not swung a hammer, but his hand was in every curve of the blade. He had proven that the cartographer and the craftsman were two parts of a single purpose, that the line drawn on parchment could guide the stroke that would one day sever the darkness from the world. A strange lethargy fell upon the Allied camps before the fever took hold. It began with a dull headache and a thirst that no amount of water could quench, and within days, the strongest warriors were trembling in their bedrolls, their bodies racked with chills. This was no enemy arrow, but a silent, creeping doom that seeped from the very ground they trusted. The healers were baffled until a sharp-eyed elf noticed the pattern. The sickness clustered around the new forward outposts, the ones supplied by a series of highland springs Elendil's own maps had marked as safe and pure. The charts had become a death warrant. Whispers slithered through the camp like poison. "He is too close to the elves," some muttered. Others, their faces pale with fever and fear, accused him of arrogance, of trusting old surveys over the land's grim new reality. The most vicious rumor suggested it was deliberate, a final, twisted loyalty to his Númenórean kin who had turned to the shadow. The trust he had spent years building was crumbling faster than a riverbank in a storm. Elendil stood before a council of grim-faced commanders, the air thick with accusation and the distant sounds of retching men. He did not plead his innocence. Instead, he asked for one thing: a small team and 3 days. To find the truth, he said, you must first find the water. His own reputation was now a secondary concern, a currency to be spent in the race to stop the dying. He took only 2 others, Elendil and a young, skeptical dwarf healer who had lost kin to the plague. They backtracked the stream to its source, high in the rocky foothills. Elendil's original map was spread on a flat stone, its lines a testament to a world he thought he understood. The spring was where he had drawn it, but the land around it was wrong. A recent landslide, subtle but devastating, had diverted a smaller, toxic trickle of water from a patch of poisonous belladonna roots and nightshade, channeling it directly into the main spring. The clean and the poisoned had mingled, creating a slow-acting venom. The error was not in his initial cartography, but in the land's violent refusal to stay still. But knowing the cause was not the same as providing the cure. The camps needed clean water, and they needed it now. Elendil closed his eyes, shutting out the suspicious glare of the dwarf healer, and let his mind drift across the mental map he carried. He thought not in terms of streams, but in terms of stone, of the hidden arteries of the earth. He remembered a survey note, years old, about a peculiar, persistent dampness on a north-facing cliff, a place with no visible spring, but with a specific, lush type of moss that only grew where fresh water wept from deep underground. It was not on any strategic map, because it was not a reliable source for an army, only a seepage, but for a desperate people, it was a lifeline. He led them on a brutal, cross-country march, ignoring the established paths, moving directly toward that remembered cliff. When they found it, the water was there, clean and cold, trickling down the granite face. They filled every water skin they carried and raced back. The return to camp was not a triumph, but a grim delivery. Elendil went directly to the healing tents, ignoring the silent stares, and helped the dwarf healer administer the clean water to the most severely afflicted. He did not speak of his vindication, he simply worked. As the color slowly returned to a young soldier's face, the dwarf healer finally met Elendil's gaze, giving a single, slow nod. The crisis had passed, but a deeper scar remained. Elendil had learned that the land could betray you not just through the malice of an enemy, but through its own chaotic, indifferent shifts. And his people had learned that the man who held the map was sometimes the only one who could lead them out of the darkness, even when they were screaming that he was the one who had led them in. The clean water from the cliff seepage saved the camp, but it could not wash away the lingering doubt. Elendil pushed eastward, driven now by a need to find something in the land that was not poisoned or treacherous. His path led him into the vast, sun-dappled forests, where the trees grew so thick their canopy blotted out the sky. His charts called this place the Brown Lands, but that name felt like an insult. The soil was rich, and the silence was not empty, but watchful. He was mapping the course of a sluggish river when he found the first anomaly. It was a grove of trees unlike any others, their branches arranged in perfect, geometric symmetry, their trunks scarred with patterns that looked less like bark and more like deliberate carving. At the center of the grove stood a single stone plinth, worn smooth by ages of rain. It was not a natural formation. Carved into its surface was the faint, elegant image of a sheaf of grain, a symbol of cultivation and order that was utterly alien to the wild heart of this forest. His lead scout, Elendil, knelt beside it, brushing away the moss. He pointed to the ground, to a scatter of unusually large and perfectly round stones that formed a deliberate path leading away from the plinth. "These are not stones," Elendil whispered. "They are petrified fruit from a tree that has not grown here for an age." The mystery was a siren's call. Elendil knew his mission was to chart the enemy's movements, not to dig into ancient legends. But the evidence was undeniable. He was standing in a garden, a place of deliberate, peaceful artistry that had been swallowed by the wild. He remembered the old tales of the Entwives, the shepherds of the growing things, who had vanished from the world long ago. The clues suggested they had not merely vanished, but had been here, and that something terrible had befallen their legacy. His search for answers led him deeper, and it was there, in a valley where the very air seemed to vibrate with a slow, deep patience, that he met the Ents. They emerged from the forest itself, their forms so like the trees they guarded that they were invisible until they moved. Their voices were the sound of creaking boughs and rustling leaves, and their thoughts moved with the pace of centuries. The eldest, a being named Treebeard, listened to Elendil's tale of the stone fruit and the carved plinth. A deep, rumbling sorrow filled the clearing. The Ents had long mourned their lost mates, and Elendil's discovery was the first flicker of a hope they had almost abandoned. The alliance he offered was born of this shared quest. Elendil and his men, with their quick eyes and detailed charts, would scour the eastern forests for more signs, mapping the lost orchards and overgrown fields. In return, the Ents would share their ancient knowledge. They spoke of rivers that had changed their beds 1,000 years before Sauron's rise, of mountains that were once hills, and of secret paths known only to the roots of the world. This was a deeper cartography, a living history of the land that no Númenórean parchment could ever capture. The strategic value was immense, but the cost was time. The Ents would ponder a single ridge for days before concluding it was indeed a ridge. A decision on which direction to search could take a week of slow, sonorous debate. For Elendil, who felt the shadow in the east growing with every passing hour, this deliberate pace was a form of torture. He was trading precious days for wisdom that might not win a single battle. Yet he persisted. He learned to listen not just to their words, but to the long silences between them, where the true meaning often lay. And when his maps were finally enriched with the Ents' slow knowledge, they revealed something his own surveys had missed: a network of hidden, root-choked valleys that could shelter an entire army from the eye of the enemy. He had gained the most powerful allies a mapmaker could ask for, but the partnership was a race between the patient turning of the earth and the frantic beating of a war drum. From a high ridge veiled in thorny scrub, Elendil watched the birth of a nightmare. Below, in the blighted plain of Gorgoroth, the skeletal frame of Barad-dûr was rising. It was not construction as he understood it. There were no scaffolds, no teams of masons. Instead, dark shapes moved in a ceaseless, hypnotic rhythm, hauling blocks of black stone that seemed to flow and fuse together like molten pitch, guided by a piercing red light that throbbed from a central pit. Elendil's hand moved across his parchment, not with the excitement of discovery, but with a methodical dread. He was not just drawing a fortress, he was charting a disease. Each day, new towers sprouted like poisoned teeth, and with their growth, the land around them withered. He noted how the few streams that braved the plain now ran sluggish and black, their courses bending unnaturally toward the dark tower, as if drawn by a terrible thirst. The very hills seemed to be shrinking, their substance somehow being consumed to feed the fortress expansion. This was not architecture, it was a dark cartomancy, a perversion of his own craft. Sauron was not building on the land, he was rewriting it, using the tower as a focal point to drain the life from the earth and pour it into his impregnable stronghold. The realization was a cold fist closing around Elendil's heart. He saw that the crystal maps from the Stargazers had shown the truth. Barad-dûr was a parasite, its foundations tapping directly into the ancient, fiery flows of Ordruin. If the tower's connection to the mountain was allowed to solidify completely, no army in the world could ever breach its walls. It would become a permanent stain on the world, a bastion of shadow that would endure for ages. He had to act now, not with an army, but with a surgeon's precision. The foundations had to be shaken before they could set. His plan was as desperate as it was simple. He would lead a small team of volunteers on a near-suicidal mission to infiltrate the construction site and sabotage the dark rituals he suspected were anchoring the tower to the mountain's power. They would carry not weapons of war, but tools of disruption, hammers of a special alloy that could shatter the focusing stones, and jars of water blessed by the elves, hoping to poison the unnatural flows. It was a gamble against an unknowable power, a race to disrupt a ritual he did not fully understand. But to stand and watch, to simply map the world's end, was no longer an option. The line between cartographer and soldier had finally vanished. The shadows of Mordor were a physical weight, pressing down on Elendil's small band as they crept through the jagged fissures leading to the plain of Gorgoroth. He led not an army, but a handful of specialists, an elf named Lauron, whose hands could soothe magical wards, and a dwarf, Grundon, who understood the language of stone and stress points. Their mission was a surgeon's strike, guided by the terrible maps Elendil had drawn from the ridge. They carried no swords for a grand fight, only satchels of dwarven fire powder and elven crystals that could disrupt dark energies, each charge destined for a precise point on his charts. These were the nascent anchors, the places where Barad-dûr's foundations were attempting to fuse with the mountain's fiery heart. The air itself tasted of ash and ozone, and a low, subsonic hum vibrated in their bones, the sound of the dark tower drinking the land's power. Leron paused, his hand hovering over a seemingly empty patch of air. A shimmering, violet web of energy became visible at his touch, a magical ward designed to trigger an alarm or worse. His fingers moved in a delicate, silent pattern, not breaking the web, but gently persuading its strands to part, creating a temporary gap just large enough for them to slip through one by one. Every step was a negotiation with invisible sentinels. They reached the first structural point, a massive plinth of black rock that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. Grundon worked with a frantic, focused speed, his tools barely making a sound as he placed the charges. Suddenly, a guttural cry echoed from a nearby scaffolding. They had been discovered not by magic, but by the simple, brutal vigilance of an Alog High, a troll of uncommon intelligence. The beast lumbered towards them, its sheer size blocking their retreat. There was no time for stealth. Leron loosed an arrow that flared with white light, striking the creature in the shoulder and causing it to roar in pained confusion. The sound was a spark in a powder keg. Alarms, both physical and magical, erupted across the site. Elendil shouted for Grundon to finish as he and the others formed a desperate perimeter, using their knowledge of the half-built terrain to their advantage. They fought a running battle through a maze of monolithic pillars and deep trenches, the dwarven explosives detonating behind them in a series of satisfying, ground-shaking roars. Stone dust and shards of black rock rained down. The mission was a success, but they were now rats in a trap, hunted from every side. Their planned escape route was cut off. Elendil's mind raced across his mental map, searching for any path, any flaw in the enemy's design. He remembered a survey note about an old, collapsed lava tube, a geological flaw the builders had not yet filled. It was a desperate gamble, a tunnel that could lead to freedom, or a dead end deep beneath the enemy's feet. They found the fissure, a crack in the earth barely wide enough for a man, and plunged into the absolute darkness below, the sounds of pursuit fading into the deep, resonant groans of a wounded fortress above them. They had bought the Alliance not a victory, but a precious delay. The foundation of the Dark Tower was cracked, its completion set back by years, but the cost of that time was a harrowing chase through the very belly of the shadow, a reminder that every line on a map carries the blood of those who dare to trace it. The cool, clear air of Rivendell felt like a balm after the ash-choked plains of Mordor, but Elendil carried no peace into the chamber where the fate of the world would be decided. Before the gathered wise, he unrolled not one map, but a library of them, a mosaic of parchment that told the story of a world under siege. He laid out the crystal charts from the Stargazers, his own surveys of the shifting mountains, and the meticulous notes from the Ents, all pointing to a single, terrifying conclusion. The time for observation was over. He argued for a preemptive strike, a unified assault before Sauron's fortress became truly unbreachable. The chamber erupted into debate. The elven lord Gil-galad stood with him, his support quiet and firm, but others were filled with dread. An elven diplomat from a distant woodland realm rose, his voice laced with fear. He spoke of the countless legions of orcs, of the sheer, suicidal folly of marching into that desolation. A dwarven lord, his beard braided for war, grumbled that his people's strength was in their mountain halls, not in throwing their lives away on an open plain. The council was fracturing along the very lines of distrust that had plagued them for ages. Elendil listened to each fearful argument, and then he stepped forward, his hand resting on the large master map of northwestern Middle-earth. He did not speak of courage or destiny. He spoke of terrain. "My lords," he began, his voice steady, "you see an impassable mountain range and a desolate plain. I see a funnel." His finger traced the path from their position to the Black Gate. He showed them how the Ash Mountains and the Juath created a narrow, predictable approach. He pointed to the plateaus his team had mapped, perfect for elven archers to provide covering fire. He indicated the solid, rocky ground the dwarven engineers had confirmed, where their phalanxes could stand firm without the earth turning to mud beneath their feet. He then unveiled his most crucial piece of intelligence, the Sabotage Mission's aftermath. "The foundations of Barad-dûr are cracked," he stated. "The tower draws power, but it is not yet whole. Every day we wait, that crack seals. Every day we wait, his strength grows. But if we move now, we force him to fight on a timeline he did not choose, on ground we have charted, and he has only corrupted." The alliance, he argued, was not a single hammer blow, but a precise instrument. The geography was not their enemy, but their greatest ally, if they had the will to use it. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The logic of the land, laid bare by his pen, was an argument no fear could refute. One by one, the dissenting voices fell silent, their objections answered not by passion, but by the undeniable lines of elevation and strategic advantage on the parchment before them. In that hushed council, the last alliance was truly born, not from a shared love, but from a shared and calculated understanding that the only path to survival led directly through the heart of the shadow. The Great Mustering began not with a single trumpet blast, but with 1,000 separate messengers fanning out across the land, each carrying a copy of Elendil's master plan. His maps now dictated the pulse of the Alliance, a complex choreography of men, elves, and dwarves moving across hundreds of miles. He had chosen the muster points not for their grandeur, but for their geography, flat, defensible plains with access to fresh water and hidden from the eyes of the enemy. One such field, Dagorlad, was selected because his charts showed its hard, cracked earth could support the weight of 10,000 armored boots without turning to mud, and its position created a natural funnel where scattered forces could coalesce into a single, mighty host. Yet a perfect point on a map meant nothing if the armies could not reach it. The first true test was the dwarves of the Iron Hills. Their king, a proud and stubborn lord, insisted on marching his heavily armored legions along the most direct route, a path that crossed a wide, slow-moving river. Elendil sent a frantic rider to intercept him. He did not command, he presented a map. He showed the king how the riverbed, according to his most recent surveys, was not gravel but deep, shifting silt. His wagons of siege engines and supplies would sink, stalling his entire force and making them vulnerable. The dwarven king grumbled, but the evidence was irrefutable. He agreed to take the longer, northern route Elendil proposed, a road that passed over solid stone bridges his own ancestors had built. It was a small victory of parchment over pride. Next came the dispute over supplies. The elven hosts, light and swift, required little, but the vast armies of men needed constant provision. The route through the vales of Anduin was the only path that could feed them, but it was claimed by two rival human chieftains who had been feuding for generations. Each refused to allow the other's supply wagons to pass through their territory, threatening to starve the southern regiments before they ever reached Dagorlad. Elendil summoned both chieftains to his tent. He did not speak of their ancient grievances. He laid a map between them and drew a single, bold line with a piece of charcoal. "This is the supply route," he said. "It runs through both your lands. From this day forward, it belongs to neither of you. It belongs to the Alliance. Any man who raises a hand against a supply wagon is raising a hand against the hope of all free peoples." He then assigned mixed contingents from both tribes to guard the route together, forcing old enemies to share a watchfire. It was a brutal, practical solution that acknowledged their hatred but rendered it irrelevant to the larger design. For weeks, Elendil became less a general and more a conductor of a discordant orchestra, soothing egos, rerouting columns, and solving problems of forage and sanitation that no Song of Heroes ever mentions. The moment of truth came when the final army, the Elves of Lindon, led by Gil-galad, marched onto the field of Dagorlad. They arrived not to an empty plain, but to a city of tents and banners, where dwarven axes gleamed beside elven spears, and the banners of a dozen human kingdoms fluttered in the wind. Every single force was in its appointed place, supplied and ready, united not by a crown, but by a map. As Elendil stood on a small rise, watching the sun glint off the greatest host the world had ever seen, he felt the weight of his leadership solidify into an unbreakable resolve. He had charted the land, he had united the peoples, and now he would lead them into the shadow. The allied host was a river of steel and determination flowing eastward, its current directed by the lines on Elendil's charts. These were not the green lands of Eriador or the misty forests of the Ents. The world outside their marching columns grew increasingly skeletal, a landscape of sharp, gray stone and dust that stung the eyes. Every landmark was a confirmation of his predictions: a twisted tree on a barren hill, a dry riverbed snaking through a canyon, each one a silent waypoint in their grim pilgrimage. The maps allowed them to move with a purpose that unnerved the enemy, bypassing the main orc-patrolled roads in favor of forgotten shepherd's tracks and geological seams in the rock. This precision, however, made them a predictable target for a foe that knew the land just as intimately. An ambush came not from the hills, but from below. As the vanguard entered a wide, sun-baked wash, the ground itself erupted. A company of orcs, having tunneled through the soft, sedimentary rock, burst from hidden fissures, their goal to split the column and sow chaos. The dwarven rear guard, acting on a contingency Elendil had drafted, immediately sealed the canyon's entrance with a controlled rock slide, preventing more enemies from pouring in, while the elven archers on the high ridges picked off the isolated ambushers with cold efficiency. The attack was repelled, but it was a warning. Sauron was not just waiting behind his walls, he was actively reshaping the battlefield against them. Days later, a greater threat emerged, one born of the land's deep instability. A deep, grinding tremor shook the earth, followed by the roar of collapsing stone. A key passed through the Ash Mountains. A route Elendil had marked as the most stable was now a jumble of fresh rubble, completely blocked. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. To turn back would mean weeks of delay, and a camp here, exposed, was suicide. Elendil retreated to his command tent, the anxious voices of his captains, a dull murmur around him. He spread his charts, his eyes not looking at the blocked pass, but at the empty spaces around it. He remembered a note from his earliest, most dangerous survey, a sketch of a treacherous scree slope leading to a narrow ledge that wound around the mountain's shoulder. It was a route he had dismissed for an army, a path for goats and desperate men, but it was their only path. He announced the new route, and the grumbling was immediate. It meant abandoning the wagons, carrying supplies on their backs, and risking a deadly climb. Yet, with the mountain's groans as a persistent reminder, they had no choice. For 2 agonizing days, the entire host inched along the precipice, a line of ants on a stone wall, each soldier praying the man in front of him did not slip. They lost supplies and a few precious lives to the dizzying drops, but they emerged on the other side, the plains of Gorgoroth spread before them like a promised damnation. Each of these delays, each tactical victory snatched from the jaws of disaster, was a tiny erosion of their morale. The soldiers looked at the ever-present smoke of Orodruin on the horizon and wondered if their clever maps and redirected marches were merely prolonging the inevitable, if every step forward was just a slower walk into the Dark Lord's waiting grasp. The cracked earth of Dagorlad drank the blood of elves and men before the first hour was done. Elendil stood not with a sword in the front rank, but at a command post on a low rise, his precious maps weighted with stones against the foul wind. Around him, the clash of armies was a deafening ocean of noise, but his world had narrowed to the parchment, and the runners who came to him, gasping and blood spattered. He was the mind of the Alliance, and his maps were its memory. He saw the enemy surging against the dwarven phalanx on the left, a tide of orcs threatening to buckle the line. His finger stabbed at a point on the chart, a dry gully hidden from the main field. He sent a runner to the elven archers, redirecting their volleys not at the front ranks, but into that gully, where a second, hidden wave of attackers was gathering. The arrows fell like black rain, and the surprise assault withered before it could be launched. Minutes later, a captain reported that the right flank was being enveloped by swarms of hill trolls. Elendil's eyes scanned the terrain behind their lines, finding a notation of an ancient, petrified forest, a grove of stone trees too dense for the massive trolls to penetrate. He ordered a tactical withdrawal, a feigned retreat that lured the roaring beasts into that stone maze, where they became easy targets for dwarven axe crews waiting in the narrow avenues. Each decision was a counter-move in a game of living chess, his knowledge of the land turning potential routes into brutal, grinding victories, but the maps could not stop every horror. He watched from his perch as a company of Númenóreans, men he had sailed with, were cut off and surrounded when the ground gave way beneath them, a sinkhole his surveys had missed. He could only watch, helpless, as they were slaughtered to the last man. The cost was etched into him with each fallen runner, each choked report of a broken regiment. The strategic victories felt hollow against the sheer, grinding arithmetic of death. By the time the sun set, painting the smoky sky in shades of blood and bronze, the plain was a charnel house. The Alliance held the field, but the price was a generation of the finest warriors. Elendil rolled his charts, his hands stained not with ink, but with the dirt and grief of the day. The scholar who had once sought to understand the world was gone, replaced by a commander hardened by necessity, his heart armored for the final, terrible march to the Black Gate itself. The ground before the Dark Lord's fortress was a slaughterhouse of shattered hopes. Elendil fought now not with a map, but with his father's sword, Narsil, its bright edge stained black with orc blood. Beside him, the Elven King Gil-galad was a pillar of cool, deadly fire, his spear eglows a blur of white light. They were the final, desperate spearhead, driving toward Sauron himself, a living wall of power and steel, against which the Shadow's armies broke like waves. But the Dark Lord was the tide, and he would not be denied. When Sauron emerged at last from the gates of Barad-dûr, his presence was a physical blow, a wave of heat and terror that stole the breath from men's lungs. The battle collapsed into a single, terrible duel. Gil-galad was the first to fall, consumed by the sheer, annihilating heat of Sauron's touch, his noble form crumbling to ash. Elendil, roaring a challenge that echoed the grief of a dying age, charged forward. Narsil flashed in the murky air, a final, defiant star, before Sauron's mighty hand swept down. The sword shattered, and Elendil fell, his body broken upon the very rock his maps had so carefully charted. As the life fled from him, his thoughts were not of kingdoms or glory, but of lines on parchment. With his last strength, his blood soaking the leather satchel at his hip, he clawed at its clasp. His son Isildur, fighting desperately nearby, saw his father fall and rushed to his side. Elendil could not speak, but his eyes, filled with a final, urgent command, locked with his son's. He pushed the heavy satchel of master maps into Isildur's hands, a legacy of ink and observation, passed from a dying king to an untested one. In that single, silent transfer, the entire war shifted. The geographical knowledge, won at the cost of so many lives, would not perish on the battlefield. Isildur, now bearing the weight of 2 crowns and 1,000 charts, stood and took up his father's broken sword. The victory that followed was bought with the blood of the greatest of their leaders. The maps survived, a cold comfort and a terrible inheritance, ensuring that even in their final, tragic sacrifice, the Mapmakers had ensured the future could still be navigated. The air on the slopes of Orodruin was thick with the stench of ash and death. Isildur stood over the scorched armor of the fallen Dark Lord, the shards of his father's sword cold in his hand. In the silence of that terrible victory, his gaze fell upon the one thing that had not been destroyed, a simple, golden band lying amid the wreckage. It seemed so small, so harmless, a whisper coiled through his mind, a promise of power to mend all that was broken, to secure the peace his father had died to achieve. He remembered Elendil's lessons, not of swordcraft, but of cartography, the constant warning that any single point of absolute control was a geographical impossibility and a moral poison. A map that showed only one perspective was a tool of tyranny. The ring offered to be that single, dominant point on the map of the world. For a long moment, he resisted, seeing in his mind the lines of all the charts he now carried, a testament to the diverse strength of many peoples united. But the ring's voice was insidious. It showed him a vision not of darkness, but of light, a world perfectly ordered, safe, and unchanging, with his own house as its benevolent guardian. It was this temptation of a good and easy peace, a world free from the messy struggles of alliance and the pain of further loss that finally broke his resolve. His hand closed around the gold. The moment the ring touched his flesh, the whispers ceased, replaced by a warm, confident certainty. He had not taken a weapon of the enemy, he told himself. He had taken a tool of healing, a means to honor his father's legacy, by ensuring no such shadow could ever rise again. He could not see that the map of his own mind was already being redrawn, the clear, careful lines of his father's teachings blurring under the weight of a beautiful, perfect lie. This single choice, made on a mountain of fire, would cast a longer shadow than any fortress, proving that the most dangerous territories are not those on any parchment, but the landscapes of the human heart. The war's end left the world scarred but watchful. With Sauron's physical form broken, the Great Alliance faced a new challenge: how to guard against a shadow that might one day gather again. The 7 Palantiri, the seeing stones forged in an age of hope, remained their most powerful tool. Their distribution became a matter of urgent strategy, a decision guided not by favor, but by the cold logic of geography. Elendil's master maps, now in the care of his sons, were unrolled once more. These charts did not show political borders, but lines of sight, hidden valleys, and strategic vantage points. A stone placed in the white city of Minas Anor could watch over the plains of Mordor. Another, sent north to the Elven watchtower at Amon Sul, could survey the wild lands of Eriador. A third was given to the master of the great harbor at Pelargir, its gaze sweeping the sea lanes for any returning threat. Each location was chosen to create a vast, interlocking web of vision, a nervous system for the reunited kingdoms, allowing them to share warnings and wisdom across impossible distances. It was a system built for unity, a promise that no kingdom would ever stand alone in the dark again. Yet, as the stones were settled into their high towers, a subtle flaw was woven into the design. The very act of separation created pockets of immense, isolated power. A king in Minas Anor, staring into his stone, could see events unfolding in the northern wastes, but the lord in the north saw only what he chose to share. The maps ensured they could see the land, but they could not force them to see eye to eye. The seeds of future discord were planted not in malice, but in the very perfection of the plan, a warning that the most powerful tools are only as strong as the hands that hold them and the hearts that guide their use. The broken sword and the unrolled maps became the twin pillars of a new age. Isildur and his brother Anarion, carrying the full weight of their father's legacy, faced a world both liberated and vulnerable. Their first task was not to rule, but to rebuild, and for this, they turned to Elendil's vast collection of charts. These were not merely maps of terrain, but documents of foresight, detailing places of strategic strength, fertile soil, and clean water sources that Sauron's shadow had never fully corrupted. The founding of Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south was a grand act of applied cartography. The white city of Minas Anor was placed on a mountain's shoulder, not for its beauty, but because the maps showed it commanded the only practical pass from the dark land of Mordor. Osgiliath was built straddling the great river Anduin at the precise point where the current was slow enough for a permanent bridge, a nexus for trade and communication. Every fortress, from the Weather Hills in Arnor to the Tower of Orthanc in Gondor, was situated according to a geographical logic their father had spent a lifetime deciphering. It was a kingdom built on the bedrock of geographical truth, a living monument to the mapmaker's art. Yet, in this act of tribute, a subtle flaw was introduced. The sheer distance between the northern and southern realms, a practical necessity dictated by the land itself, began to strain the bonds of brotherhood. The maps that had united a continent for war could not always bridge the political divides of peace. Different threats, different allies, and different priorities slowly pulled the two kingdoms onto separate paths. The very geographical advantages that made them strong, the mountains and rivers that defined their borders, also became the walls that encouraged them to look inward, not toward each other. Elendil's vision had been one of unity, but his tools had inadvertently laid the foundation for a division that would echo through the centuries, proving that even the most perfect map cannot chart the unpredictable terrain of human hearts and royal succession. On a high courtyard in Minas Anor, where the stone was still pale and new, Isildur knelt to plant a single sapling. Its bark was white as snow, and its leaves shimmered with a silver light. This was no ordinary tree. It was a scion of Nimloth, the white tree of Numenor, and its placement was no act of sentimentality. He consulted his father's charts one final time, unrolling the worn parchment in the clear mountain air. Elendil had marked this very spot, a nexus of converging ley lines and a natural wellspring deep beneath the rock. Strategically, it was the most defensible point in the entire city, a final redoubt. Symbolically, it was the heart. By planting the tree here, Isildur was not just founding a garden. He was declaring that the new kingdom would be rooted in the same deep, life-giving truths as the old. The tree was a promise, a living echo of a lost homeland, and its fragile roots were a testament to a hope that refused to die. From that day forward, the health of the white tree became inextricably linked to the health of the kingdom itself. In times of peace and prosperity, it would bloom with a fragrance that filled the entire city, a silent affirmation of wise rule. In times of decay or weak leadership, its branches would grow bare, its leaves falling like forgotten promises. It stood as a constant, living reminder that the strength of a realm is not measured by the height of its walls, but by the vitality of its foundations, a truth first mapped not by a king, but by a cartographer who understood that some lines are meant to be grown, not drawn. For a time, the lines on the maps became the pathways of peace. The great roads that once guided armies now carried merchants and messengers, their routes secured by the shared understanding of the land. A dwarven caravan could travel from the Iron Hills to the forges of Gondor, its route meticulously charted, and its safety guaranteed by the border markers agreed upon by all kingdoms. Elven craftsmen shared their knowledge of the hidden, starlit paths with the rangers of the north, not for war, but to ensure swift travel and the safe passage of wisdom. This was the golden age the war had purchased, a fragile equilibrium where trust was woven into the very geography, a living network built upon the foundation of Elendil's life's work. Yet, this peace was a careful construction, not a natural state. In the quiet halls of Minas Anor, the scribes tasked with updating the great maps began to note subtle, unsettling changes. A trading post in the south would report that a familiar spring had suddenly run dry. Rangers patrolling the eastern reaches of Arnor would speak of a strange silence falling over certain valleys, as if the birds and beasts had been frightened away. These were whispers, faint and easily dismissed by those enjoying the prosperity of the realm. But for the few who still studied the old charts, who remembered the cost of their creation, these anomalies were like a single discordant note in a familiar song. They were the quiet reminders that the world was not a static drawing, but a living, breathing entity, and that shadows could gather in the unlikeliest of places, in the blank spaces between the lines they thought they knew so well. The quiet anomalies noted by the scribes were the first flickers of a new need. From the white city of Minas Anor to the ancient libraries of Linden, a consensus grew that the knowledge Elendil had died to protect could not be entrusted to kings and princes alone, for their priorities would always shift with the winds of politics. And so, in a hall built into the side of the mountain that overlooked the fledgling city, the Guild of the Quill and Star was founded. Its members were not soldiers or nobles, but scholars and surveyors, each trained in the meticulous methods Elendil had perfected. They were the keepers of the knowledge, and their first act was to take a solemn vow, not to any single king or kingdom, but to the land itself and all free peoples who lived upon it. Their charter was a single, beautifully illuminated map of northwestern Middle-earth, and beneath it, the words, "No line for one, every line for all." This ideal was beautiful in a scroll, but it was tested daily in the grid of reality. A guild cartographer named Elendil, the same scout who had walked with Elendil in the early days, was dispatched to the realm of a petty king in the southern vales. His task was to update the charts of a newly discovered mineral spring, a source of great wealth and health for the local people. The king, a man named Castamir, welcomed Elendil with feigned courtesy. He provided him with comfortable quarters and every comfort, but his eyes gleamed with a possessive light. When Elendil completed his survey, a masterpiece of detail, showing not just the spring, but the entire watershed that fed it, Castamir demanded the original parchment. "This is my land," the king declared. "The knowledge of its waters is mine to control, mine to sell." Elendil refused, his hand resting on the guild pin at his cloak. "The water flows from the high mountains through the earth that belongs to no king," he explained calmly. "My vow is to chart its truth for the shepherd on the hill and the merchant in the city alike. To give you this map alone would be to give you a knife to hold at the throat of everyone downstream." He was imprisoned for his defiance, his tools and maps confiscated. It was only the discreet arrival of 2 dwarven guildsmen, who reminded Castamir of the trade agreements and military pacts that relied on the guild's impartial maps, that secured Elendil's release. The map was copied for the king, but the master copy returned to the guild archives, a small victory for a principle that had nearly cost a man his life. The guild's greatest challenge, however, was not the greed of men, but the slow, creeping tide of forgetting. As the memory of the war faded into legend, the reasons for their strict vows began to feel like ancient history to a new generation. Younger apprentices, born in peace, would grumble as they spent weeks verifying the exact course of a stream. Why does it matter if this bend is 100 paces to the east or the west? They would ask. We are not at war. The older keepers, men and women, with lines on their faces earned in the wild, would take them to the great chamber of the archives. They would unroll a map from the time of the Alliance, pointing to a seemingly insignificant notation. "See this mark," they would say. "This indicates a type of moss that only grows where the bedrock is granite." That knowledge told a dwarven patrol that they could hold a position without fear of the ground collapsing. This small, winding line for a deer trail, it allowed an elven messenger to bypass an orc encampment. Every contour, every notation is a word in a language. If we get lazy and write the words wrong, the day we need to read it again, the story will be a lie and people will die. The preservation of knowledge they taught was a constant, quiet war against the erosion of time and comfort. It was a battle fought not with swords, but with the relentless, patient stroke of a pen, ensuring that the light of understanding would never be extinguished, no matter how long the peace might last. The peace of the white tree's bloom was a fragile shield. Decades flowed like a quiet river, and the careful maps of the guild gathered dust in their archives, consulted more for trade routes than for troop movements. But the land itself began to whisper of a sickness returning. A young apprentice, the grandson of the scout Elendil, was sent to verify a report from the eastern fringes of Gondor. His task was simple, to confirm the course of a minor tributary to the river Anduin. He arrived to find the waterway exactly where the old charts said it should be. Yet something was deeply wrong. The current, once swift and clear, now moved with a slow, oily deliberation. The reeds along its banks were not green, but a bruised, blackish purple, and the air carried a faint, metallic scent that clung to the back of the throat. It was not a change a casual traveler would notice, but to a trained eye, it was as jarring as a shout in a silent hall. He took his measurements with a trembling hand, comparing the water's strange pH to his guild's baseline records. The numbers did not match. The land was being poisoned from within. Back in the guild hall, the old masters pored over his report alongside other, scattered anomalies. A veteran keeper unrolled a chart of the eastern mountain passes, her finger tracing a route marked as stable. Rangers now report rockfalls there with an unnatural frequency, she said, her voice low. The slides always seem to open new paths from the east, while blocking our own patrols. It is not random erosion, it is surgery. The evidence was a mosaic of dread, each tiny piece meaningless on its own, but together forming a terrifying picture. The shadow in the east was not just stirring, it was once again learning the shape of the world in order to break it. The guild faced its gravest test since its founding. To sound a public alarm, to go before the steward of Gondor and the Council of Arnor with their findings, would shatter the hard-won peace. It would rekindle every old fear, demand new taxes for armies, and send a generation that knew only prosperity, marching toward an uncertain war. They would be accused of warmongering, of seeing phantoms in every shadowed valley. Yet to stay silent, to file the reports and do nothing, was to betray the very purpose for which Elendil had died. It was to allow the enemy to redraw the borders of reality, unchallenged, until one day, the gates of Mordor would swing open onto a kingdom, lulled into a fatal sleep. The weight of the decision settled on the new generation of mapmakers, a burden of ink and parchment that now felt heavier than any sword. They had inherited the quill, and with it, the duty to write the first line of a new chapter, one that would either save their world or condemn it through their silence. The poisoned river report lay on the table between them, a single sheet of parchment that felt heavier than stone. Elendil's grandson, a young man named Surion, was the first to break the tense silence in the guild hall. "I will go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He had not known his famous grandfather, but he had been raised in the shadow of his maps. The lines on those old charts were as familiar to him as the lines on his own hands, a legacy he carried in his blood. This would be more than a survey. It was a pilgrimage into his own heritage, a chance to walk the paths Elendil had drawn and see if the world still matched the memory. His father, Isildur's brother, placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes filled with a complex mix of pride and fear. He gave Surian not a sword, but the original oilskin-wrapped map of the Eastern Vales, the one Elendil himself had carried on that first fateful expedition. The journey east was a lesson in contrasts. Surian traveled with a small, trusted party, their passage swift and unchallenged through the settled lands of Gondor. They followed roads his grandfather's maps had helped plan, crossing bridges that had once been strategic choke points and were now bustling with merchants. It was easy to believe the peace was eternal here, but as they moved beyond the watchful eyes of Minazanar, the land began to change. The air grew still, and the cheerful chatter of birdsong faded. They reached the blighted river, and the scene was worse than the report had described. The water did not merely look foul, it seemed to absorb the light, its surface a slick, unmoving black. The purple reeds along its bank were brittle to the touch, crumbling into a fine, gray dust. Surian unrolled his grandfather's map, the parchment crinkling in the unnerving silence. According to the precise notations, a vibrant fishing village should have been nestled in a bend of the river, just a league to the south. When they arrived, they found only the skeletons of a few stone foundations, being slowly consumed by a creeping, thorny vine that none of them could identify. The map was right, and the world was wrong. This was the heart of the chilling truth. Pushing deeper into the foothills, they relied entirely on the ancient charts to navigate a landscape that seemed actively hostile. One afternoon, they sought shelter from a sudden, acidic rain in a cave system Elendil had marked as stable and dry. The entrance was where the map promised, but inside, the walls were seeping a thick, tar-like substance that smelled of rot. As they retreated, a low rumble echoed from the depths, and a section of the ceiling, where the map indicated solid granite, collapsed behind them, sealing the passage. It was not a natural cave-in. The land itself was being unmade. The greatest test came when they tried to verify the course of a hidden mountain pass, a route Elendil had discovered with the help of the Ents. The map showed it winding behind a waterfall, but when they arrived, the waterfall was gone, the river above having been diverted. The cliff face was now a raw, recent landslide. Surian stood before the impassable wall of rubble, the old map in his hands, feeling suddenly useless. He closed his eyes, shutting out the despair of his companions, and let his mind drift over his grandfather's notes in the margins, the tiny sketches of rock formations and tree types. He remembered a story his father had told him about how Elendil could feel the shape of the land, even when he could not see it. Surian looked away from the blocked pass and studied the lay of the land around it, the way the surviving trees leaned, the pattern of the scree at the base of the slide. He led his team on a brutal, day-long climb up a nearby ridge, a route not on any map. From the summit, gasping for breath, he looked down and saw it. The pass was not gone, it was simply buried, but the geography of the ridge, the specific curve of the valley below, it all matched the larger context of his grandfather's chart. The truth of the map was still there, just hidden under a layer of calculated ruin. He had not found a safe route, but he had found something more valuable, the unshakable certainty that his grandfather's work was not rendered obsolete by the Shadow's manipulations, but was in fact the only tool sharp enough to detect them. He was no longer just verifying a report. He was bearing witness to a quiet, ongoing war for the soul of the world, a war his family had been fighting for generations. The silence in the archives of Minas Tirith was a presence of its own, thick with the scent of aged vellum and beeswax. It was in this hallowed quiet that a young archivist, sorting through a long-forgotten chest of Elendil's personal effects, found it. The parchment was brittle, its edges crumbling, but the lines drawn in faded ink were unmistakable. It was a map of the White Mountains, yet it was unlike any other. This one was unfinished. It depicted a known trail that branched off into a blank space, a deliberate void in the center of the mountains. In the margin, in Elendil's precise hand, was a single, startling notation. Final Redoubt. He had not been charting a path for an army. He had been designing a sanctuary, a hidden city of last resort for his people, should the Shadow ever rise again. It was a contingency plan, drawn in a moment of profound foresight, a secret seed of hope, planted for a future he would never see. The discovery sent a ripple through the court of the steward. Here was a direct command from the founder of their kingdom, a task left deliberately incomplete. To finish the map was not merely an act of cartography, it was an act of faith. It meant accepting that even in an age of peace, the duty of a ruler was to prepare for the unthinkable. The stewards of Gondor, the caretakers of the throne, took this charge as their most sacred trust. They became the guardians of the unfinished line. Over the generations, in times of quiet prosperity, they would dispatch their most discreet and skilled rangers into the high, lonely places of the mountains. These expeditions were not about conquest or discovery, but about fulfillment. They were answering a question posed by a dead king, seeking the specific valley, the defensible cliff, the hidden spring that would complete his vision. Each new detail added to the parchment was a quiet victory, a stitch in a safety net woven for a fall they prayed would never come. The map itself was never displayed, never celebrated. It remained in its chest, a secret known only to the ruling steward and a handful of sworn cartographers. Its power lay in its potential. It was a promise to the future, a declaration that the people of Gondor would not be caught unprepared, that the wisdom of the past was a living guide. The simple, unfinished line on that ancient parchment became the most profound symbol of their enduring vigilance, a quiet testament to the idea that the greatest hope often lies not in the battles we win, but in the refuges we build long before the storm ever breaks. Darkness did not creep back into the world, it fell like an axe. The assault came not at the fortified gates of Minas Tirith, but from the sky, a swarm of fell beasts, ridden by Nazgûl, that descended upon the city's highest level. Their target was not the throne room, but the archive, the heart of the guild's knowledge. At the same moment, coordinated attacks erupted at the northern outpost of Fornost and the elven haven of Rivendell, a precise, surgical strike against the three pillars of the map keepers. The enemy's strategy was terrifyingly clear: to blind the free peoples by burning their eyes. Sauron, now a senior keeper, was in the White City's map room when the first shriek echoed off the stone. He did not reach for a weapon. He roared a single command to the panicked scribes: save the master copies, the originals. The chamber became a frantic, ordered chaos, as apprentices and masters alike worked not to fight, but to preserve, rolling priceless vellum scrolls and sliding them into protective bronze tubes. The heavy oak doors shuddered under a brutal impact. They were trapped, but Surian's mind was not on the door. It was on his grandfather's maps, on the memory of a hidden path through the mountains. He shouted over the din, pointing to a seemingly solid section of the bookcase-lined wall. Behind the histories of the Second Age, there is a seam in the stone. My grandfather's chart of the city's construction marks it, an old builder's passage for the aqueducts. It leads down to the 6th level. They shove the heavy case aside, revealing a narrow, damp opening just wide enough for a single person. As the doors splintered behind them, the last keeper slipped into the darkness, the legacy of 1,000 surveys clutched to his chest. This was not a retreat. It was a strategic withdrawal into the very bones of the city Elendil had helped plan. Below, the battle for the streets was a nightmare of fire and shadow, yet the defenders fought with an uncanny advantage. Captain Elendil, Surian's cousin, did not deploy his soldiers along the main avenues. Instead, he used the guild's detailed urban charts to move his companies through a secret geography of the city, through root cellars that connected entire blocks, across the rooftops of the artisans' quarter, and along the dry culverts beneath the main thoroughfares. They appeared where they were least expected, ambushing orc patrols from behind, and then vanishing back into the city's hidden arteries. The enemy, expecting a straightforward siege, found itself tangled in a maze it could not see, fighting the city itself. The climax came at the old guest house on the 4th circle. Surian and his small band of keepers had been cornered there, their escape route cut off by advancing troll. From the rooftop, Surian saw Elendil's company, pinned down in the square below, caught in a crossfire. He unrolled the only map he had left, a detailed survey of the city's water and drainage system. His eyes fixed on a notation for a massive, iron-bound sluice gate that controlled the flow from a cistern above the square. It was meant for flood control, a piece of civic engineering. But in that moment, it was a weapon. He sent 2 swift apprentices scrambling across the rooftops, their path clear only on his chart. They reached the cistern house, and with a great, groaning shudder of metal, they released the gate. A wall of water, stored for a dry season, thundered down the steeply sloped street, sweeping the orcs from their feet and clearing the square. The tactical victory was sudden and brutal, but the true triumph was silent. As the water receded, revealing the stunned but victorious defenders, Surian looked at the soaked, crumpled map in his hand. It had not held a battle plan, but the blueprint of a living city. That day, the cartographers did not just protect parchment. They demonstrated that their knowledge was the very circulatory system of their defense, a network of truths that could, when needed, become a shield, a sword, and a river to wash the darkness away. The war ended, but the lines on the maps remained, etched now into the very foundations of the new age. The cartographers of the Second Age were not remembered as dusty scholars in forgotten libraries, but as the quiet architects of victory. Their pens had drawn the borders of nations and charted the courses of rivers that would nourish cities for thousands of years. The safe routes they documented became the trade roads that wove disparate kingdoms into a tapestry of mutual dependence. The high, hidden places they found became the sites of watchtowers and fortresses, their strategic placement a permanent deterrent against the Shadow's return. Every thriving city, from the white walls of Minas Tirith to the bustling ports of the south, stood as a monument to their foresight, built upon ground they had first deemed secure and fertile. Elendil's true legacy was not a single crown or a shattered sword, but this enduring peace, a world made stable through shared understanding. It was a testament to a profound truth, that the courage to chart the unknown is the first essential step toward building a future that can withstand the darkness. Yet the world is a living parchment, and its coasts and rivers continue their slow, patient dance. New mountains push skyward over millennia, and ancient forests reclaim forgotten paths. The work of the mapmaker is never truly finished, for every answered question reveals a new horizon, and every settled border hints at a mystery waiting just beyond the edge of the known. The greatest journeys are always those